My uncle stood up at the company holiday party, raised his glass, and told 300 employees that I had finally found my place at the family business, as if I hadn't spent 6 years trying to leave it for something I'd actually chosen for myself. What he didn't know was that I had already been accepted into the graduate program I'd applied to in secret 18 months earlier. What he didn't know was that the rejection letter he thought he'd successfully orchestrated, the one that ended my first attempt to leave 6 years before this party, had actually been a forgery. A reference letter he had promised to write and never sent, followed months later by an email he sent in my name withdrawing my application entirely 3 days before the deadline, without my knowledge or consent. I found out about both in full 4 months before that holiday party, when a former assistant of his, leaving the company on good terms, quietly handed me a printed folder on her last day and said only, "You deserve to know what actually happened." My name is Carla Espinoza. I am 29 years old. I worked at my family's manufacturing company for 6 years, believing the entire time that my own application failures were the reason I never left. They weren't failures. They were sabotage. And I was about to make sure my uncle understood exactly how completely his plan had unraveled. I want to explain the specific kind of trap that exists in family businesses, because if you've never lived inside one, it can be hard to understand how something that looks from the outside like opportunity can actually function as a cage. I joined my family's manufacturing company at 23, immediately after college, in what felt at the time like a natural and even fortunate path. My uncle, Rahman, had built the company from a small operation into a genuinely successful regional manufacturer over 30 years, and bringing the next generation into the business felt to everyone around me like exactly what should happen. What I didn't fully understand at 23 was that my uncle had very specific plans for what the next generation should look like, and that those plans did not include the version of myself I actually wanted to become. I had always been drawn to environmental science, specifically sustainable manufacturing practices, an interest that, ironically, could have meaningfully benefited the family business if anyone had been willing to let me develop that expertise somewhere else first and bring it back with real credentials behind it. Instead, I spent 6 years in a junior operations role, watching promotions and meaningful responsibilities go consistently to my male cousins, while being told repeatedly that I needed more time to prove myself before taking on anything more substantial. I told myself for years that this was simply how family businesses worked, that patience would eventually pay off, that my uncle's frequent reminders about loyalty and family commitment reflected genuine values, rather than a carefully maintained system designed to keep me exactly where he wanted me. 6 years ago, at 23, 18 months into working at the company, I applied to a competitive graduate program in environmental engineering at a university across the country. It was, at the time, the most ambitious thing I had ever attempted on my own. I needed 3 letters of recommendation. 2 came easily from professors who supported my undergraduate research. The third, the program specifically requested, needed to come from a current employer or supervisor, confirmation that I had real-world experience relevant to the program's focus on industrial sustainability applications. My uncle was, on paper, the obvious choice. He had genuine standing in the regional manufacturing industry, and a strong letter from him would have meaningfully strengthened my application. He agreed enthusiastically when I asked him 6 years ago, almost suspiciously enthusiastically, looking back now with everything I eventually learned. He told me he was proud of my ambition, that he would write something wonderful, that I shouldn't worry about the deadline because he had plenty of time. The deadline came and went. I asked him, with increasing anxiety, whether the letter had been submitted. He reassured me each time that it had been sent, that these things sometimes took time to process on the university's end, that I shouldn't worry. 3 days before the program's final deadline for completing my application file, I received an automated email confirming my application had been formally withdrawn at my request. I had not requested that. I called the admissions office in a panic, only to be told that the request had come through the proper channels, from my own email address, with appropriate verification. I did not, at 23, have the technical knowledge or the immediate suspicion to understand how someone might have accessed my email account to send that withdrawal request. I assumed, in the chaos and disappointment of the moment, that I had somehow made an error myself, or that the program had simply made an administrative mistake that I lacked the standing to successfully dispute as a first-time applicant with no resources to escalate the situation. My uncle expressed sympathy when I told him what had happened. He told me these things happen, that the program clearly wasn't meant to be, that there would be other opportunities down the road. I believed him completely. I want to be honest about that, because I think understanding how completely I believed him matters for everything that followed. I trusted my uncle. He had been a significant and generally positive presence throughout my childhood, and the idea that he might have actively sabotaged something this important to me did not occur to me as a real possibility. Over the following years, I applied to 2 additional graduate programs, both times less competitively, both times less seriously, having internalized somewhere beneath conscious awareness the belief that perhaps I genuinely wasn't suited for the kind of academic path I'd once wanted. Both later applications were unsuccessful, for reasons that in retrospect had much more to do with my own diminished confidence and effort than any external sabotage, a kind of self-fulfilling consequence of believing falsely that my first failure had been entirely my own fault. I settled, slowly, into the role my uncle had clearly always wanted for me. Dependable, present, available, never advancing meaningfully, but never leaving, either. 4 months before that holiday party, Marisol, my uncle's long-time executive assistant, who was retiring after 18 years with the company, asked to meet me privately on her last day. She handed me a manila folder. Inside was a printed copy of an email from my uncle to himself, dated 6 years ago, containing a draft of a recommendation letter he had written and never sent. Beneath it was a printed copy of the email sent from my email address, requesting the application's withdrawal. An email, Marisol explained gently, had actually been composed and sent from my uncle's computer, using access credentials he had to my company email account from when I'd asked him to help troubleshoot a technical issue years earlier. She told me she had kept these records quietly for years, uncertain whether or how to ever bring them forward, until her retirement finally gave her the freedom to do something she had wanted to do for a long time. She said, "I always felt sick about it, Carla. I should have told you years ago." I sat in my car in the company parking lot for nearly an hour after Marisol left that day, reading through every document in the folder multiple times. The recommendation letter draft, never sent, was actually generous, thoughtful, specific, the kind of letter that would have genuinely strengthened my application. He had written it, he simply never sent, and instead, 3 days before the deadline, used access to my own email address to withdraw my application entirely, ensuring the gap created by the missing letter would never even need to be addressed or questioned. I understood, finally, with complete clarity, exactly what had happened 6 years ago, and exactly how thoroughly it had shaped every choice I'd made since. I want to be honest about the specific kind of grief that came with this realization. It was not simply anger at my uncle, though that anger was real and significant. It was grief for the version of myself who had spent 6 years believing she simply wasn't capable of the path she had once wanted, when in reality, that path had been deliberately and secretly closed off by someone she trusted completely. I did not confront my uncle immediately. I drove home, sat with my husband, and explained everything I'd learned. He listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and eventually said something that helped me think more clearly about what to do next. I spent the following several months managing two parallel processes simultaneously, completing a strong, carefully controlled graduate application, while also deciding exactly how and when I wanted to address what my uncle had done 6 years earlier. For the application itself, I selected references entirely outside the family business: a former professor I had stayed in contact with, an industry contact I had built independently through a professional association, and a current manager from a department my uncle had no direct oversight of. I changed my email account's security settings and credentials before beginning any part of the process, taking no chances with a repeat of what had happened before. I was accepted into the graduate program 18 months before that holiday party, earlier than the party itself, meaning I had been quietly planning my actual departure from the family business for well over a year, working through the practical details of relocating, giving appropriate notice, and structuring my exit in a way that wouldn't create unnecessary disruption for the teams I worked with. I told very few people during that period. My husband knew, obviously. My mother, who had her own complicated history with my uncle's controlling tendencies within the family, knew as well, and was, I think, quietly thrilled to watch me build an exit plan she had wondered for years whether I'd ever pursue. I did not tell my uncle anything during this period. I wanted my actual departure to happen on terms I controlled completely, informed by full knowledge of what he'd done, rather than risking another opportunity for him to interfere if he somehow learned what I was attempting before I'd secured it. I also, during this same period, consulted briefly with an employment attorney about the legal implications of what Marisol's documents revealed, specifically the unauthorized access to my email account and the fraudulent withdrawal request sent in my name. The attorney confirmed that this likely constituted both a breach of computer fraud statutes and a form of fraud more broadly, though she noted, accurately, that pursuing formal legal action 6 years after the fact would be complicated, costly, and uncertain in outcome, especially given the difficulty of definitively proving who had accessed the account at the time, absent Marisol's testimony, which itself would need to hold up under scrutiny. I decided, ultimately, that legal action wasn't the path I wanted. What I wanted was simpler and, in some ways, more meaningful. I wanted my uncle to know, directly and unambiguously, that I knew exactly what he'd done, and that it had failed completely to accomplish what he'd intended. The holiday party, 18 months later, gave me exactly the moment I'd been waiting for. My uncle's toast, congratulating me on finally finding my place at the company, was delivered with the kind of warm, public confidence that comes from someone who has never once considered that his version of events might not be the only one in the room. I let him finish completely. I smiled, the way you smile through a toast you have no intention of correcting in the moment it's happening, in front of 300 employees who had nothing to do with what was actually unfolding beneath the surface of that party. About 20 minutes later, I found him near the bar, away from the main crowd, and asked if I could speak with him privately for a few minutes. We stepped into a quiet hallway just off the main event space. I told him, calmly and directly, that I wanted to share some news. I had been accepted into a graduate program in environmental engineering 18 months earlier, that I had already completed most of the program's first year remotely while finishing out my responsibilities at the company, and that I would be formally relocating and transitioning to full-time study within the next 2 months. His expression shifted immediately from confused to defensive. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner, why I was springing him on this at a company event, what this meant for the projects I'd been managing. I told him I had something else to discuss first. I handed him copies of the documents Marisol had given me, the unsent recommendation letter, the fraudulent withdrawal emails sent from his own computer using access to my account. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he understood what he was looking at. I said, 6 years ago, I thought I had failed to get into a program I genuinely wanted. I spent 6 years believing that failure was my own fault and shaping my entire career around that false belief. I now know that you wrote me a generous letter and then made sure it never mattered by ending my application before anyone could notice the letter was missing. I'm not here tonight to have a legal fight about this. I'm here to tell you that it didn't work. I got there anyway, just 6 years later than I should have, because of what you did. He did not deny it. I want to note that specifically, because I had genuinely wondered in the months leading up to this conversation whether he would simply claim the documents meant something other than what they obviously meant. Instead, he said quietly, I thought I was protecting the company's future. I thought you'd thank me eventually. I told him I understood that he believed that. I told him it didn't change what he actually did, and the 6 years it cost me believing in a false story about my own capabilities. I left the family company 2 months later, exactly as planned, relocating for my graduate program with my husband's full support and a level of clarity about my own capabilities that I hadn't felt in nearly 6 years. My uncle did not apologize formally, in any complete or satisfying sense, in the months that followed. He acknowledged, briefly, in one subsequent conversation, that he had made a mistake, language that fell considerably short of what I think the situation actually deserved, but which I ultimately decided not to spend additional energy fighting for. What mattered more to me in the end was simply no longer living inside a false narrative about my own choices and limitations. I completed my graduate program 18 months after relocating, graduating with genuine distinction in a specialization I had wanted authentically for nearly 7 years by that point. I now work for an environmental consulting firm specializing in sustainable industrial practices. Work that I've come to understand with some irony could have benefited my family's manufacturing companies significantly if my uncle had simply trusted me to develop that expertise and bring it back, rather than working actively to prevent me from ever developing it at all. My relationship with my uncle remains distant and complicated. We see each other at larger family gatherings, maintain basic cordiality, but the closeness that once characterized our relationship throughout my childhood has not returned, and I'm not sure, honestly, that I want it to in the same form it once existed. What I think about most looking back on this entire experience is how close I came to never knowing the truth at all, how easily 6 years of false self-doubt could have simply continued indefinitely had Marisol not made the quiet, courageous decision to finally tell me what she had carried for so long. I think about her often. I sent her a long letter after I graduated, thanking her properly for what she'd done. She wrote back a short note that I keep, still, in the same drawer where I once kept the rejection that turned out to never have been a rejection at all. It said simply, "You always belonged exactly where you ended up. I just helped you see it a little sooner than you would have otherwise." If Carla's story reminded you that the story you've told yourself about your failures might not be the true one, and that it's never too late to find out, hit the like button. For every person who believed, for years, in a limitation someone else quietly created for them. Before you go, I want to ask you something honest. Has anyone ever discovered later in life that something they believed was their own failure was actually someone else's interference? Type yes in the comments if you've ever found out the truth was different from the story you'd been carrying for years. And wherever you're listening from tonight, drop your city and the local time. I love knowing exactly how far this story reaches. If this is for someone you know, someone who has quietly given up on a dream they once had, believing it simply wasn't meant for them, share it with them. Sometimes the door was never actually closed. Someone else just convinced you it was. I'll see you in the next story. The lounge is always open.